I was at a charity book sale and I met this guy and we started chatting about life and about books, and he dropped a bombshell into the conversation. And as he carried on talking, I thought to myself, I can make a film about this guy. And just as I was thinking it, he looked up at me and he said, Jeremiah, you could make a film about me. So I picked out 5 books that say something about his life and asked him to talk about them. And here it is.
The importance of being earnest. Really the most perfect artificial comedy that's ever been written. I don't think there's any competitor. I mean, every line is a stunner. Jack Worthing, whose real name is of course Earnest, was found in a handbag, and he didn't know who his parents were. He tries to say the handbag is rather a smart one. It must have been left by a lady of fashion. It has handles. It was in the cloakroom at Victoria Station, and he says, yes, the Brighton line, because the Brighton trains, the Brighton side of the station was the smarter bit. But then Lady Bracknell says, the line is immaterial. A handbag. The Brighton line. I will not allow my daughter to form an alliance with a parcel. I am particularly looking for the Spanish Seaborne Empire by J.H. Parry in the 1960s Penguin edition. Well, my connection to Oscar Wilde, well, obviously I am a gay man. I'm someone who has tried to be a writer. I haven't achieved his level of fame, of course. And of course I've been to prison as well. And in my background, it's almost as if I myself came out of a strange handbag. I mean, I always thought that my parents, when I was a child, were English and Portuguese, and that my father was half Scottish. But the man who brought me up was not my father. He turns out to have been, I think, my uncle. And my father was in fact German, and his father as well. He seems to have been some sort of Nazi. I had a very lonely childhood, and I tended to take refuge in books. So books became identified for me with hope and happiness, and that's still the case. I explore London by almost every possible means, tube, bus and railway. And I also walk like blazes all over the city.
This is a Piccadilly line service.
When you board the train, please remember to take all your belongings with you.
I've got a lot of haunts for finding books. I use a lot of the charity shops. Then I sometimes go into the West End. For about 30 years, or perhaps even more, I've been haunting any amount of books. Now this is a book to which I contributed.
Ooh, there's a bit of gosh, Josh.
Yes, it was fortuitous, wasn't it? Sorry, it was wonderful time, you know. It was money for jam, really. And here I am, C.A.R. Hills. In the novel Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov believes that he can get away with murder and not feel remorse, that he's justified in killing a pretty awful old woman. After he succeeds in doing the crime, I didn't succeed, he feels overwhelming remorse and a need to confess, which I would surely have done, and eventually he ends up in prison. But to him it is a liberation, and right at the end of his novel, Dostoevsky says, here begins a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a man, of his gradual rebirth, of his gradual transition from one world to another. And this is a very good description of my own prison experience. And I am profoundly grateful that I did have this prison experience. And I would recommend it to almost anybody. I learned to sweep in prison. You know, I'd never swept in my whole life. And I thought that you went round and round in a circle to sweep. I didn't realize, but a female warder in Belmarsh pointed out to me that you have to bring the dirt towards you with the broom.
What's going on in the Old Bailey, Charles?
Well, I think that was the court I was in, court 13.
What led to your plans for murder, Charles?
Oh dear, my plans for murder were to do, as almost everything in my life was, to do with my mother. She had gone back to Portugal after her retirement, and she took a man into her house. I reacted in a very hostile way to his presence in the house and in her affections. She was eventually persuaded to leave him the lifelong right to the house, but his rights would fall with his death. And that obviously gave me a huge motive for wanting him out of the way. In many ways, I think my anger was more with her than with him. But obviously I couldn't get at her. So I began to look for a hitman. Eventually somebody put me in touch with people that he said were hitmen, but they turned out to be undercover policemen. And one morning I was eventually arrested by them and pleaded guilty and was sentenced. Obviously the Bible is the central text, not only of the Christian faith and the Old Testament, the Torah of the Jewish faith. It is also the foundation of a great part of Western culture with the Greek and Roman classics.
The next stop is Bank. When this train terminates, please remember to take all your belongings with you.
We are living in a very skeptical and secular world, and if you're going to be a sensitive Christian, you cannot be too insistent on it. But I certainly hold to what I believe to be the central truths of my faith. Quite often, in almost every day, and most days, I tend to go to a place where they offer free food, and that is very often a church hall. It's obviously the churches that tend to do that, not always. The Bible, as Christians have it, is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there's also the Apocrypha. The New Testament tells us in the four Gospels all that we can possibly know about Jesus. Most of what Jesus says emphasizes quite deep commitment and a hard task. Take up your cross and follow me. But consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I tell you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Great Expectations is the closest of Dickens's books to my heart because he's tapped into a universal theme, the theme of the expectations that we all have of what life might bring us, and the fact that those expectations, maybe they will not be utterly dashed, but they cannot provide us with the exact fulfillment that we seek. And that is the theme that Dickens has so beautifully illustrated in this book with all its great wisdom and sadness. And I think this was most wonderfully illustrated in the original ending of the book, which Bulwer Lytton persuaded Dickens to change to a slightly more optimistic ending. Pip, the hero of the book, loves Estella, but she has been trained by bitter Miss Havisham to be incapable of love. She cannot love, and therefore, though Pip longs for her, she can never be his, and this is an absolute. Pip meets her, and she's been married and been cruelly treated. Now she's married again. They meet in Piccadilly. She's in a carriage and she stops to talk to him. A casual meeting, but he has to find in it what he needs to find. And the beautiful last words of the original book are his feeling of assurance that suffering had given her a heart to know what my heart used to be.
Wow. What do you think of Bulwer Lytton as a novelist?
Bulwer Lytton was not only a totally crass novelist himself, he also managed to ruin Dickens's best book. I absolutely loathe him. Well, I think I always have had great expectations. They've mainly been dashed. I mean, I often think that after eating and sleeping, my most common experience is rejection. But actually, you know, hope springs eternal in the human breast.
Do you feel yourself as if you are something of a Dickensian character?
David Copperfield. Two characters in that novel which make me think that I myself am out of Charles Dickens. And this, of course, is Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, who are always waiting for something to turn up, but always in some sort of fix. And I identify strongly with this somewhat feckless couple. I'm looking for the Odyssey by Homer. Do you have a good edition of it? It's very difficult to get a feeling for Homer, except in the sense that he's the closest of all authors to being a universal author. He seems to explore in his two great epics. Let's leave aside the question of whether he wrote either or both, or whether there was a Homer, but he seems to have encapsulated a great deal about human life one, the experience of struggle in the Iliad, and the Odyssey is like the journey that we all take, and which cannot of its nature ever be completed till the time of death. He says, I long to see my homeland and the day of my return. That is my most deeply felt wish. But we have no homeland in this world, not even in the people that we most love. And then would you like to take the other two out of my hand? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Anyway, cheers.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
I myself, though, have come back to London, to the area where I was born. Like Odysseus in Ithaca, it may be that I will have to make more journeys, that they will be difficult, but I hope to come back to die in the place where I was born. I too have this deep longing to return.